Hello and welcome to the Putting the Science in Science Fiction panel. I'm Trisha Narwani, the editorial director for Del Rey Books, which is Penguin Random House's science fiction and fantasy imprint. And I'm honored to share the stage with two of the most brilliant writers in the genre, both of whom have some very unique perspectives on the relationship between science and storytelling. Rob Reed is the founder of Listen.com, which built Rhapsody, the music service that created the streaming subscription model that has since been adopted by Apple and Spotify. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Year Zero, a work of fiction, Year One, a memoir about student life at Harvard Business School, and Architects of the Web, the first true business history of the internet. As a security contractor, government civilian, and military officer, Mike Cole's career has run the gamut from counterterrorism to cyber warfare to federal law enforcement, and he recently starred in the CBS reality series Hunted. As an author, Mike is the creator of the Shadow Ops series and the Shadow Throne series. So Rob, you portray a somewhat negative scenario of AR in the opening scene in your new novel, After On. Do you think that AR poses more risks to society than benefits as it matures?
No, I actually think it has an enormous benefit that it's going to bring to us. But and this will harken back to something I'd said earlier. But I think that one of the great functions that storytelling, and particularly speculative fiction, can play in society is to paint pictures of the future that we'd rather not inhabit before we come to those decision points that are either going to bring us to that future that we may find unattractive, or will bring us to a future that we find much, much, much more palatable. And so the scene in the book that you're referencing, and by the way, the folks who got the little excerpts of the giant book, it's in there. This actually connects to something that was mentioned on a previous panel, 2 panels ago, where the person was talking about using the AR dating and holding up a phone to somebody and seeing their profile, which is a pretty stilted way to go about it. The scene that I depicted in this particular scene in the book was something that basically these 2 kind of creepy guys are in a bar and they're scanning around the bar, and they've got AR hardware that we can only dream of right now. But Marone told me we could have this within 5 years. So this is something that is a near-ish future thing that we need to think about. And what the magnificent UI on this magnificent hardware is displaying for them, it's identifying everybody that they're looking at and giving pretty damn creepy details about them. Things that none of us would want a stranger to know about us when we're occupying a physical space with them. And that's not the main driver of the story, and the lesson of the novel is certainly not that AI is evil or it's going to take us to terrible places. But I do think that there's this very, very powerful and important and interesting ethical question that we're going to need to address as AR becomes more and more mainstream and proliferates in society. So we're going to be in this space where suddenly we'll be able to bring the omniscience of the interview and append it to people who are occupying space with us without their knowledge or permission. And they get to do that to us as well. And I think that's a fascinating issue. I think it's a fraught issue. And I think it's something that we should start thinking about now or a year ago, long, long before it becomes something that we're facing out in society. Because if we haven't thought that kind of thing through before it becomes possible, there is a real risk of a sort of Hindenburg moment when something awful happens that was unanticipated, and there's terrible, terrible blowback on the technology and the industry. So that's what I was thinking.
So Mike, I know you have some interesting real-life experience with AR. Tell us a little bit about that and if it had any influence on your work.
So my background's entirely in military law enforcement and intelligence. And I understand that you guys here are focused primarily on digital iterations of AR. I see a lot of goggles, right? There's a tactility to military and intelligence and law enforcement applications that can't be lost. And a couple of examples I was discussing with Rob before the panel. So for example, how many of you guys have been in the military, or how many of you have been involved in a quick draw scenario where you have to clear a weapon out of your holster quickly? You have, okay. So one guy in the room knows that that's a tactile experience. If you're gonna train, if you add a light to a Picatinny rail on your pistol, and you have to clear that pistol, you have to do it 1,000 times with that light on there, because that tiny little addition of weight to your barrel is going to make a difference in how quickly you clear your holster, right? So most law enforcement people train using something called FATS, Firearms Training Simulator, which is exactly what you think it is. It's a giant theater with screens, and it's like Nintendo Duck Hunt. You have a simulated gun that uses compressed air to inaccurately, in my opinion, simulate the recoil, right? And that tactility, the compressed air simulating the recoil, and the clearing of the holster, this is an augmented reality experience. No one is wearing goggles, and that tactility is critical in training the student for tactical scenarios and tactical evolutions. And it's a different way of conceiving AR. So when I see like these goggles that people have, and I see Oculus Rift, all of this is amazing to me. But that is not going to train a helicopter pilot who has to do a hard landing under fire, and he's got to feel the tremble in the pedals accurately and understand how that translates to the airframe, right? Those kinds of challenges guide AR in armed, professional, violent spaces. And since that's what I write about, that's what I'm thinking about all the time. It helps for me that while Rob is doing science fiction, you'll forgive me if you are writing fantasy and I'm not. I do fantasy, which gives me a wonderful and convincing out, right? Because I have magic. So I can,
I do too.
Right.
It's called 21st century technology.
That's right, yeah, exactly right. But one of the things that any good writer of fantasy will tell you is that if you make a magic system that is too numinous and doesn't have logical rules that the audience can get a hold of and hold the writer, establish a contract with the writer, your audience is going to be like, whatever, dude. Anything can happen. There's no way to create dramatic narrative tension. So when I do magic in my training scenarios that is influenced by the AR I've seen, I'll give you an example. I have my combat training happening in one of my magical scenes against earth elementals, right? Because earth elementals can tactily rise out of the ground, they can present bladed targets, they can hit and be hit, the chunks of them can break off, they can take cover, they can rise from cover, and you can actually shoot them because they're not people, so you don't have to worry about killing them, right? And you can actually have the recoil in that weapon instead of relying on compressed air. So I really am very heavily informed by the AR, even as I extrapolate it with magic. And I do that because I'm writing military books that I know are being read by military people who have all trained using FATS. And if I hand wave it, they're going to be like, this was crap, because they all came up with that stuff. And there's lots and lots of examples of it. So I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you guys about it, because one of the things I never see in discussions of AR in the futurist forums that I hang out in, and I do cyber threat intelligence for a large police department that I'm not supposed to tell you is the NYPD. So I spend a lot of time on futurist forums, and it's all AR, and no one ever talks about tactility. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to address that to you.
Yes, I'm really interested in hearing you both talk about the real-world implications of technology. When a lot of people talk about science fiction, they talk about it predicting specific technological developments. How interesting is that to you versus thinking about the social and cultural implications of the technologies you're describing or predicting?
I think they're both hugely important. And there is, I always take a little bit, and we've talked about this before, I take a little bit of caution when I hear the word prediction, because we're storytellers, and we're not necessarily saying that we think this is going to happen, which means we're not necessarily failures if that thing that we described didn't happen. I mean, much as people who write historical fiction aren't actually saying that this person said that to that other person. But nonetheless, I do think that there's this very important role of depicting the futures, both that we want to and do not want to inhabit. And so I don't want to be, I actually think we've overdone it at this point with dystopian fiction. And I do think, I was saying earlier in the day in a different setting, I think George Orwell deserves immense credit for helping to forestall the widespread just proliferation of totalitarianism at a time when that seemed inevitable in human history, simply because he scared the bejesus out of hundreds of millions of people in 1984 by saying this is what it could be like. So I do think dystopian has a very important role, but I kind of feel like we're overdoing it at this point. Just one more grim, starving, burnt-out shell. I mean, I know they get to reuse the sets in Hollywood, and that saves a great deal of money. It's like Elon reusing the rocket tubes, It's like, boy, that's a good thing to do. But also painting the pictures of the futures that we want to inhabit. And I think that's another thing, you know, like who doesn't want to live in Brave New World? I'm kidding. But the other thing that I think is really important about the feedback loop between today's technology and that which we speculate about, whether it's powered by, you know, bits and atoms technology or magic, we're kind of conjuring the same type of thing. I think what's really fascinating is the feedback loop between tomorrow's inventors and even today's inventors and today's storytellers. Every scientist and technologist I've ever known, and I worked in high tech myself for almost 20 years, every one of us was at some point in our lives, maybe at many points, inspired by science fiction, inspired by fantasy, inspired by those cool spells and devices that can do things that we can't do just yet. And I think that that role is a very, very important thing. And therefore, I think, particularly when you're writing a harder form of science fiction or a near future or even present tense science fiction, the rules don't apply as much when you're 500 years out. But I think that puts a responsibility on us to describe things and depict things that are in pretty close alignment with how they work, how they will work soon, definitely consistent with the laws of physics. Because if you shatter all that stuff, as people start figuring that out as they go deeper into their education, it's going to kind of invalidate a lot of what they've been exposed to. So I think that, you know, even though we feel like we have this infinite license as people writing speculative fiction to say whatever the hell comes to our mind, I think a deep, deep grounding in reality is actually an important contract to write with our readers. And that's one reason why I stay, even though I'm not an entrepreneur anymore, I stay deeply, deeply connected to the tech scene, which is why I'm here today.
Just to follow on to what he said, the two best examples I like to cite, and there's a great quote we always say, there's a military conception called 5GW, or fifth generation warfare, that counterinsurgents and counterterrorism professionals, it's a theoretical model and doctrine that we all live by, but the quote that encompasses is that anything one man can imagine, another can make real. And the two best examples of that I can think of are Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the submarine, which the conception of the submarine, which actually gave rise to the actual submarine, that is a proven statement, and Orson Scott Card's Ansible, which preconceived the internet, preconceived wireless comms, wireless NICs. So both of these things are science fiction conceptions that, and I'm sure we could come up with 1,000 more examples here. And I know that tech geeks are geeks. I'm in a room full of you guys, right? And I know I'm the same way. Guys, some of you are not. I apologize. And you read this stuff. And whether or not you're cognizant, the last guy up here, you said you're playing D&D. So I know you're in the same pool that I am. Right, well, now he's trying to deny it. But the point I'm trying to make is that these things are influencing you. And now that they've come into pop culture with the Harry Potter movies and this rush of superhero movies and the popularities of Comic Cons that we spend half of our lives speaking at, you are being influenced by this. And it is informing your entrepreneurial decisions and the technologies that you develop. So I just want to make sure that I gave those examples direct from science fiction novels that Rob had mentioned.
So does knowing that your work has this influence on scientists give you a feeling of responsibility to always get the science right? And do you ever feel that that is ever at odds with telling a good story?
It's different for me because I write about magic.
But do you want to get the magic right?
No,
There's
but
a lot of aspiring magicians out there too.
But I will say this. I will say this. I am extremely cognizant of, because I am representing the military and law enforcement. And if you're a nerd in science fiction and fantasy is basically divided up into political camps. There's a bunch of right-wing authors that have some purchase on military science fiction, and I'm pretty much the only left-wing author who's actually serving or served recently and is still with law enforcement. So I sort of have this carved out niche. So I'm cognizant constantly of my audience looking at me. My representations of the military matter, and what I say about the military matters, and how I depict them matters. And I do feel that weight very heavily, and I feel it, and of course you have that incredible feeling of never being able to get it right. And that's why something like the reflection of AR in training scenarios, like I've described to you, becomes a very fraught experience to me. Because there is no topic more politically charged right now than military, law enforcement, and intelligence. Right now, there are hearings going on at the highest levels of our government. The DNI is testifying right now, before Congress over a major momentous issue that could affect all of our futures. This is some heavy, heavy stuff. And what do? People get very, very invested when someone has possession of their story, right? And I am taking possession of that story when I come out. So something as specific as the AR scenario I described to you becomes very, very heavily invested, and is just as significant to me writing about magic as I would argue is getting technology right to something someone who's writing science. I do also want to hammer that earlier point I made about consistent magic systems. I will talk to you all day long about the rules of magic systems and how they must extrapolate scientifically. The best example of this I can think of is Patrick Rothfuss's sympathy system in his wildly successful Name of the Wind, which if you haven't read,
Read it.
If you haven't read, read it. And you will see where it is a magic system. It is fantasy. It is numinous. And it is obviously based on very sound principles of science that he worked very, very hard just so he would not lose you as an audience when he brought it to you.
Yeah, electromagnetic systems and other things. He worked real hard on that stuff. And again, I think mainly because I do write things that are very, very near future. My new book is set 9 seconds into the future. Whenever you're reading it, it takes place 9 seconds later. And it's tricky because it's, as you guys saw earlier, it's 550 pages long, and it usually takes a little bit longer than 9 seconds to read, but we'll worry about that later. I think when you're writing stuff that's near future or near present, we could almost call it, I think that you really do have an obligation to get the science right. And so I spent probably close to 150 hours interviewing folks like you, interviewing technologists and scientists, and then also there's a strong geopolitical dimension to my book as well. And so folks in that domain too, because you are going to tell, amazing stories do unfold in our world every day. And particularly when you grant yourself license to push a couple elements of technology, I probably push 2 of them, one of which is AR, maybe 5 to 7 years into the future, but nothing super deep future. Since so much amazing stuff can happen in the world as it exists today without fanciful technology or fanciful magic, I think, yes, you do, if you're setting it in the present day, you do have an obligation to anchor it in reality, because this is a great opportunity to sneak really cool learning into people. And a friend of mine, her kids hate vegetables, and she has this concept of hidden vegetables, and she'll somehow get broccoli into the cake and all this stuff. And I think that as a storyteller, when you're dealing with science and technology, you can do that hidden vegetable thing. So I think there's in my book, there's a lot of, particularly synthetic biology and quantum computing, there's a lot of hidden broccoli there. And if I were
it's really tasty broccoli.
It's
though.
tasty broccoli, yeah, because it's deep fried in bacon. That's the other thing that's the key to both good science fiction and hidden vegetables. But yeah, I think that is something, because there is such a great opportunity to impart knowledge to folks while you're hopefully entertaining them.
Well, Rob, you mentioned earlier having a certain amount of dissatisfaction with dystopian scenarios. Are there any technological trends that you're writing about in your book that you're really excited about and really hopeful about? And same to you, Mike.
Yeah, pretty much all of them. So the things that come off, I'd say, is most scary in this particular book. They are things that I'm genuinely scared about. And so there's synthetic biology, which I think has tremendous power or potential to go very, very wrong, and it's artificial superintelligence, which some of the smartest people in society, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, are all on record in the very, very recent past as saying, oh my God, this could go so wrong. So those are alarming, but I believe that we will shoot these rapids, and I believe that synthetic biology is going to really radically reduce human and animal suffering, beginning unfortunately, perhaps not ending in our lifetimes, but certainly we're going to start seeing very, very significant fruits from that while everybody in this room is alive, and maybe we'll never even die. Maybe Ray Kurzweil is right. But I think that the promise of SynBio is tremendous, and I think there's a lot of very, very good, well-intentioned, ingenious people who are working really hard on these issues, and they're also worried about plugging the holes that can be dire. And with artificial superintelligence, There are terrifying scenarios that can happen if you really, really extrapolate out. But there's so many wonderful things that can happen that are going to empower society and empower us and save lives and improve lives and so forth on the path between here and when we really need to start being careful, that I think there's just a huge, huge amount of abundance that we're going to harvest from that. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about most things.
Yeah, I don't. Again, my entire life is lived. My entire professional life is surrounded either killing people or preventing people from being killed or killing people. So, and honestly, what I've seen, and I also just started doing my first ancient history, military history book. So I'm now looking at people killing each other a long time ago, and technology is basically a net positive. I've never seen, I really can't think of any example where a major technological innovation has not overall, over the long and strategic view, made life better. So I'm very, very bullish about it. But what I'm most excited about from my own field, and again, when I think of AR, I probably think of it more expansively, maybe incorrectly because I'm not an entrepreneur in the field, than you do. And I'll give you the best example, the thing that I'm the most optimistic about right now, and that's data visualization. What does data moving on the internet look like? How can you see it? You can't. The reality of it is it's friggin' invisible, right? It's pulses of light on fiber optic cable, or it's electrical signals moving across. You can't see that. So every time, if you go to Google the Norse attack map on your phones right now and pull it up, you're going to see augmented reality, right? You are seeing a visual representation of a reality that you cannot perceive with your naked eye, which is electrical signals. Movies like Tron, right, which we all laugh at, that is a brilliant friggin' idea. That is someone attempting to create a visual context to a thing that is invisible and a very important thing that we all need in our daily lives. And it's super important to me because my job is to protect you from crime. And I can't do that when I'm looking at, first of all, I can't do it by looking at pulses of light on a fiber optic cable because my human eyes are incapable of making reason come out of that. I sure as hell can't do it from reams of logs that IT infrastructure are putting out because it's, 7 gigs of lines of writing. My eyes will bleed. I can't do that. The only way I can do my job is when hyper-intelligent systems take all of that textual data and those flashes of light and render it into some kind of visual map, sometimes in 3D, and has kind of proactive alerting that is built around that map. And this is a digital thing that I know you guys can understand. That is absolutely augmented reality. It is not reality, right? Just like a Oculus Rift isn't reality. I am seeing a visual construct that's being made. And there are tremendous advances in that. I'm sure all of you have heard of Palantir. Maybe you haven't. I'm going to pretend that I'm sure because it will make my point more effective. But programs like Palantir, which if you haven't heard of, you can Google it, you can see pictures of what it looks like. That was as instrumental to me tracking and killing terrorists in Iraq as it is to me tracking and finding intrusions against police networks that will protect confidential informants from being killed here in the United States. That is tremendous. And everyone is worried about cybersecurity these days. In my opinion, totally unjustified. Like the threat is nowhere close to how terrified everybody is. And you as tech people know, people are terrified about it because nobody knows what a computer is or how it works. So like everyone's like, oh my God, they're going to shut off the traffic lights. They're not going to shut off the traffic lights. It's okay. Figure out how to defeat a phishing attack. But I do feel like we are going to become a lot more secure in that field because of these kinds of advances that allow me to use my human computer to manipulate the computer to more effectively protect you. And I'm most bullish on data visualization. I think it's huge.
Yeah.
Luckily, the good guys tend to be smarter than the bad guys. It's true, and that generally, and that helps a great deal in these sort of duels between darkness and light when they're on the technological battlefield.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very
Thank you,
much
everybody.
for sticking around for this. Thank you.